안녕하세요. UK Talks 웨비나 시리즈 2탄, 이번에 8번째 세션에 참석해 주셔서 감사합니다. 저는 주한영국문화원 교육사회실 홍지연입니다. 지난 12월에 진행했던 학부편 웨비나 시리즈에 보내주신 뜨거운 성원에 힘입어 이번에는 석박사 유학 그리고 커리어 개발을 주제로 총 11개의 웨비나를 준비하였는데요. 이번 세션은 대학원 진학이나 취직 혹은 이직을 앞두고 영어 인터뷰를 준비하고 있는 분들께 유익한 시간이 되기를 바라며 8번째 세션 시작하겠습니다. 본 세션에서는 주한영국문화원 어학원의 앤드류 워슬링 선생님이 영어 인터뷰를 준비하는 꿀팁들을 대방출할 건데요. 발표가 끝나면 참석자 여러분들의 질문에 대해서도 답변할 시간을 가질 예정입니다. 시작에 앞서 간단한 당부의 말씀을 드리고자 합니다. 본 웨비나는 약 50분간 영어로 진행될 예정입니다. 먼저 연사의 발표가 끝난 후 실시간 질의응답을 가질 예정이니까 궁금한 점이 있다면 채팅창에 질문해 주세요. 컴퓨터로 접속하신 분들은 화면 우측에 채팅창이 있고 모바일 기기로 접속하셨으면 상단에 물음표 아이콘 누르시면 채팅창이 나옵니다. 또 다른 사람이 질문한 것이 또 공감이 가거나 혹은 마음에 드는 답변이 있다면 좋아요 버튼 눌러주세요. 좋아요가 높은 질문 위주로 골라서 답변을 부탁드릴 예정입니다. 그리고 저희가 댓글이나 코멘트에 올라온 것 중에서 랜덤으로 한 분께 약속하지만 저희 선물을 드릴 예정이니까 끝까지 자리 지켜주시면 감사드리겠습니다. 그럼 지금부터 시작하겠습니다. Hi, Andrew. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for waiting for our opening in Korean. Dear audience, I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Andrew Watling, Academic Coordinator at British Council Teaching Centre. His presentation will be on how to make a good impression at English academic and job interviews. I'll hand over to Andrew now. Andrew, we're now ready for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Ji-hyun. As Ji-hyun said, my name is Andrew Watling. I'm an academic coordinator at the British Council Uljiro Centre in Seoul. And today we're going to talk about my top tips for interview success. Some of you may be interested in how to succeed in a job interview, others in an academic interview, and hopefully we can cover all of those bases. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's what we're going to be talking about today. One of the main things that's very important in a job interview especially is making small talk, something that's often underestimated. We're going to spend some time speaking about that first of all. And we're then going to move on to talk about strengths and weaknesses, which is absolutely key. We're then going to talk about the STAR method, which in my opinion is the best method for talking about your achievements and giving examples. We're going to also look at some questions that you can ask at a job interview. And we're going to round off today with my top 5 interview tips. And after that, we'll have a live Q&A session where I'll be able to hopefully answer some of your questions. Next slide. So, as I said, we're going to be looking at academic interviews versus job interviews today. Next, please. Thank you. So as you can see here, we have a picture of a UK university. So academic interviews are different in a number of ways to job interviews. I think one of the main differences, of course, is that there is a wider focus on your study record. While that may come into a job interview, I think experience is likely to be much more important there. And I think there's obviously going to be a slightly less formal atmosphere in an academic interview as well. Next picture, please. There are, of course, some similarities as well between job interview and academic interview, and hopefully we'll be able to kill 2 birds with 1 stone with a lot of the advice I'm going to give today. Obviously, they both require you to speak about yourself, to speak about your strengths, and to give some real examples of challenges you've faced. Next slide, please. So, first of all, let's compare 2 major types of interview, okay? Next picture, please. These are competency-based and strength-based interviews. Okay, these are two quite different styles of interview. They're especially used in job interviews. Next, please. So first of all, competency-based interviews are much more focused on skills. Okay, and the point of a competency interview is that the employer is trying to measure your abilities in this case. So it's much more focused on what you are able to do. It's more structured and it focuses much more on the kind of skills that you need to do your job. So that's what they're testing there. This is probably the most common type of interview, but I would say that strength-based interviews, next please, are becoming more and more common. Okay. So they are more personal in nature, and strength-based interviews try to focus more on finding out about what you enjoy doing and what you are passionate about. Okay, this idea originated actually in sports science from the idea that athletes are generally able to perform at a much higher level if they are invested in what they're doing and if they enjoy what they're doing. And this has been applied to jobs as well. The idea that if you have a certain passion for your job or for a certain area, that you will be better at it. And this is what they're trying to find out about in a strengths-based interview. So it's much more personal. And these are also quite good for people without a lot of work experience as well, as they can focus on your personal qualities a lot of the time, in addition to experience as well. Next slide, please. And next again, please. So first of all, let's take a look at some typical strength-based interview questions. Okay, so what do you do in your spare time? Jihyun, if you could just, thank you, go through these questions one by one. I think if you click a few times, you should be able to reveal a few questions for me. Thank you. Okay, so these are a few examples of some types of interview questions you would see in a strengths-based interview. If you just have a look through these, I'm going to give you just one moment to read through these questions. So as you can see, these questions are not really that concerned with ability so much as things that you enjoy doing and things that you're good at doing. Now, if we compare that, next slide, please. And okay, if we compare these to competency-based interviews, you can see that some of the competencies, it's got quite a different focus in general to a strengths-based interview. Okay, so here are some of the competencies that employers are kind of seeking. So adaptability, commercial awareness, communication, conflict resolution. These are the kinds of focuses that you might have in a competency-based interview. So you can see that the focus will be quite different. Next slide, please. So one thing I'd like to talk about, which is important in all kinds of interview, both academic and job interview, and also in strength and competency-based interview, whichever kind, is making small talk. As I said at the beginning of the lecture, this is something that is quite frequently underestimated by people. But connecting with your interviewers and trying to appear as natural as possible in an interview setting will be a big bonus for you, and so this gives you a much better chance of getting your job or getting the position you're looking for at the institution you're applying to. Okay, next please. So as I said, connecting with your interviewer is very important, even if when you're making small talk, it seems like the topics aren't very important. I mean, this is really the first stage of the interview when you've just come into the room. It might not even last very long, but it can be crucial because the topics may not be important, but the interviewer is still evaluating you the whole time. Even while you're talking about whether it may be your journey or the weather, appearing natural and being able to engage in conversation in a natural way is still part of what you're being judged on. That may not even be conscious in the interviewer's mind, but it will definitely influence their impression of you. Next, please. So this also helps to make a lasting good impression as well. So the way you interact with somebody is often as important as what you're saying in terms of content. And that sometimes can be what sticks in people's mind even more than what you've actually said. Next, please. Obviously, being natural and avoiding as much awkwardness as possible is going to be a major bonus. Interviews are, I would say, often a very kind of false situation. They are a kind of manufactured situation. They're not natural by their nature. So being able to appear natural and being able to make that kind of awkward and uncomfortable feeling go away is something that is going to be good for you and the interviewer. So that's definitely something that you want to work on. Next, please. Ultimately, what you want to do here is to try and build the impression that you haven't memorized your answers as well. So again, we'll talk about this a bit more later, but looking as if you're not reading from a script and that you're speaking in the moment, engaging with those ideas is something that is basically crucial to being able to tackle an interview and an interviewer's questions properly. And a part of that comes in the small talk at the beginning. Next slide, please. Okay, so after you've kind of moved on from the small talk, something that will come into play in every interview, whether it's competency-based or strength-based actually, is talking about your strengths and weaknesses in some way. We're going to talk about, first of all, how to speak about your strengths. Next, please. So, making the most of your strengths. Next, please. So, first of all, we're going to talk about giving evidence with examples. Okay, it's really important that you don't just speak about what you're good at. You talk about why you're good at it and some examples from your past experience that show how you are good at this. Next, please. One of the ways that you can do this is using adjectives. Now, it's very common that people want to talk about themselves in the best possible way, but sometimes people can go a bit too far and use very extreme adjectives. You want to avoid, if possible, using extreme adjectives like awesome or incredible. Nobody wants to say I'm incredible at IT or I'm awesome in terms of my interpersonal skills. This can sound arrogant, and most of the time it isn't true. So try to use more professional sounding adjectives. Some good examples might be saying that I'm driven, I'm a meticulous person if you're good at organization, I'm persistent if you're able to go back to a task and complete it even if it's difficult, or that you are well suited to a role, or that you are engaged. Try to prepare a list of adjectives that you feel do describe you well, which are accurate, but which aren't going too far in terms of being extreme. So that's something that you would want to avoid. This is something that you can prepare to an extent beforehand, but remember to be concise as well. Interviewers don't want to hear you waffling on for too long, and that can make you actually look quite nervous. Next, please. So there's a kind of a balancing act here as well. You don't want to appear overly animated and overly enthusiastic in your job interview because it looks unnatural. At the same time, you also want to appear motivated, and you want to explain why you're motivated. So there is a kind of a balance here, I would say, between looking unmotivated and looking motivated to the extent where it looks like you're faking it. So obviously try to be as natural as possible. If you have a genuine motivation, of course, that helps a lot. But even in the cases where you might not feel genuinely motivated about something, you want to be able to sound as if it's something you want to do without sounding fake. So that's something that you can work on as well, and try to get feedback perhaps from people you know if you want to kind of set up a practice interview with the types of questions that you might field. Next, please. And obviously, you should always read the role profile in detail before you go to an interview. And when you're thinking about what adjective should I use to describe myself, what strengths should I focus on, always try to match them as closely as possible to the strengths that are demanded in the role profile, okay? And it's usually possible to do that. Sometimes the role profile might mention things that you're not genuinely good at, and sometimes you might want to be honest about that, but try to think creatively about which parts of the job and the role profile you can match to your own strengths, and even if you have to, slightly exaggerate sometimes. Next, please. So something that comes up a lot, people struggle to deal with, is talking about your weaknesses. People often think it's a good idea to say that they don't have any weaknesses. This is something you should never do in an interview, okay? Another thing that people like to say is that, oh, my biggest weakness is that I am a huge perfectionist. This is a massive cliche. This is something you should avoid as well. Interviewers have heard this a million times, so I would avoid saying that, okay? Pick a genuine weakness, okay? Next, please. Next again. Okay, so the best thing here is to focus on things that you have done to overcome your weaknesses. Pick a genuine weakness. For example, I used to be very, very poorly organized, but I have found a number of workarounds for dealing with this. I now, for example, set reminders on my phone. I keep a diary. I use my Outlook calendar as fully as possible with reminders. And talk about the workarounds you have and how these have helped you, and how, while you obviously maybe have not completely overcome this weakness, you've found ways to get around it. This, I think, is a more honest approach, is a more genuine approach, and I think it's something that interviewers will genuinely appreciate, okay? And give some examples of how you've made progress with your weakness, okay? Have you received any positive feedback on becoming better at managing your weakness, okay? So this can kind of make you sound like somebody who is a good developer and somebody who is willing to grow, which is something that interviewers are always looking for, okay? What we're going to move on to next is talking about the best method for talking about your experience and giving good examples. So you may have heard before about the STAR method. The STAR method stands for situation, task, action, and result, okay? This is something that's easy to remember, and it's something that's especially good because you can pre-prepare a number of possible examples before the interview, okay? So let's take a look at what it's made up of and why it's so useful. The first stage, next, is situation. And the situation stage, it doesn't have to be a situation which is directly related to your position, okay? But it should be a situation that you were genuinely in at some point. A situation where something needed doing. Now, setting the scene at this stage should probably be the shortest of the STAR stages. You don't need to spend long on this, maybe just a few, 20 or 30 seconds talking about what that situation was. And you would then move on to the task stage. The task stage, again, should be quite brief, but this is talking about the situation or maybe even a problem that you were faced with, and then talking about the task that you had to do to solve that problem or to deal with this situation. Now, the next stage, which is the action stage, this requires the lengthiest explanation. This is the most important stage of the four, okay? Here is where you focus on what you did, okay? Now, it's very common, a common mistake here is that people talk about their team. What we did to combat this situation, or what my team did to combat this situation. But remember, the focus is on you, and you should focus on your own achievements here, okay? So highlight the contributions you made, even if you tackled this situation as a team, okay? So this is the most important stage, I would say, and the one you want to spend the most time on. The final stage is the result stage, where you want to describe the kind of 2 or 3 most impressive results, okay, of your actions. So give examples of the effects of your efforts, okay? Were there any long-lasting changes which affected your company, okay, or that increased profits, or that had a serious implications for staff, okay, in a positive sense? Also, don't forget to talk about how you learned from this situation and how you developed throughout this, okay? And you can use this STAR system for talking about long projects, okay, that took place over a number of months that had very, very significant results. Or you could use it just as easily for talking about an emergency situation that you dealt with on one day. For example, I was once running late for a conference and I had the speaker with me who had to get there by 12 o'clock. Unfortunately, there were delays, so we had to ask somebody to step in at the last moment. You could then move on to talk about, after your actions, what were the results, and how your actions that you did, and the things where you stepped in very quickly, actually, in this case, maybe saved the day. Again, you can also use it for longer projects as well, which might take a bit longer to talk about, but you can use this for talking about a number of different situations. And as I said, it's a good idea to have a kind of bank of these to talk about before you go into an interview. But the most important thing here is to always be very precise about the results that you achieved, okay? And that's going to help you sound a lot more convincing, and it's going to provide better evidence, okay? So when you're using the STAR system as well, another thing to remember is don't be explicit. Don't say STAR in the interview. It should be as seamless as possible, okay? You want it to sound like you're telling a kind of professional anecdote or a story. So don't break it down into sections. Make it sound like you're just telling a story, but this is just a kind of structure for your story, which will help you, okay? Next, please. We're going to move on now to talk about some of the key questions that you should ask in an interview, okay? A lot of people get to the end of an interview and they say, I don't really have any questions. I think you've basically answered everything for me. Even if the questions you had in your mind have been answered by the interviewer already, you should still have some questions to ask. Most interviewers, when you ask them, how do you feel when a candidate doesn't have any questions for you at all? Most of them say, I view that very, very negatively, okay? If you have questions, it shows that you are interested, you're enthusiastic, and that you are engaged, okay? These are all qualities that the employer is looking for. So like small talk, this is another example of how your behavior at an interview can be just as important as the content of what you're saying. It also gives you a final chance to highlight any relevant qualities or experience you have. So if you don't have any questions, it can make you look kind of underprepared, or maybe that you're not even really that interested in the role. So how many questions should you have? I would say around 4 or 5 is a good number. So some of these might have already been answered in the interview. You don't have to ask 4 or 5 questions, but you should have 4 or 5 ready in case some of them are answered already, so that you have some left to ask at the end, okay? And finally, one more thing I would say before we look at some examples is questions about salary or holiday allowance, things like that. You should save those till later. Do not ask them at the interview, okay? They're definitely reasonable questions and something I'm sure that you would want to know in a job interview, but wait until you get an offer before you ask those questions. So those are the questions to ask in between receiving the offer and signing your contract, okay? Next, please. So we're going to look at the kind of questions that you could ask first at a job interview, and then the kind of questions that you might ask at an academic interview. Next, please. So first of all, you might want to ask very tactfully about the working conditions. I don't mean here about days off and holiday and things like that. I mean what it's like to work day to day at the office, okay? You could ask about the office setup, or whether working from home is encouraged, which is a very legitimate question nowadays. Next, please. You also might want to find out what an average working day might look like as well. This is useful to know. Next, please. And professional development opportunities. This is a really good question. If they haven't answered this already, this is something that you should always ask. It makes you look motivated and ambitious. Even if you're not necessarily interested in getting a promotion, training is definitely something that you might want to ask about because it shows that you're willing to grow as a professional. Next, please. So at an academic interview, what kind of questions might you ask there? Next. So a good question is to ask what previous graduates have found valuable. So this is a good question because it's about people who've already finished their course, who have already been through this and have come out the other side and are now working. Universities regularly send out surveys to graduates to ask them about what they found valuable about the course. So this data definitely exists and they should definitely know about this, and that could prove useful to you. Next. So make sure you ask about any opportunities, especially if you're interested for internships or perhaps work experience through your course, okay? There are often these opportunities available, but they're not always that clearly advertised. Being a student representative as well can make you sound very keen. Next. One thing you should never do, either in a job interview or an academic interview, is ask about how much time off you will have, okay? It might make you sound kind of like you just want an easy life, okay? It might make you sound like you're not really that interested in studying, that you're just interested in taking trips to other cities or going around Europe or something like that. This is obviously a huge benefit of studying abroad, but it's not necessarily something you want to ask in the interview. You might again want to ask this later after you've been offered a place. Okay. Next. Okay, we have I think about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to finish today by talking about my 5 kind of top interview tips. Okay. The first thing that I would say is don't forget the basics. Okay, this might sound very obvious, but you want to dress appropriately. You want to be punctual. When I say punctual, I don't mean too punctual. You don't want to arrive 2 hours early. That would probably just be more inconvenient for the people who are interviewing you than anything else. But do arrive slightly early, and you should bring everything you need. Another thing that interviewers often say is that they quite often judge candidates who turn up empty-handed to an interview. People who don't walk in with a pen or a notebook, you often think, well, perhaps you might need to write something down. If you have some questions, you're going to want to write that information down so you don't forget. So please bring that with you. If you want, you could obviously bring water with you, but you may well be offered that. Don't be afraid to say no if they offer you a glass of water or something. It's always good to have some with you. And remember to try to be positive, as positive as possible throughout the experience. Next. So make sure that you are well prepared for the interview. And when I say well prepared, I don't just mean in terms of the situations that you're going to talk about, your experience, your strengths. Obviously, you will have prepared for the kind of questions that are going to come up in the interview, but also be prepared in terms of doing your research about that particular company or organization, or the academic institution that you are applying to if it's an academic interview. You want to sound motivated, you want to sound interested, and you can increase that sense by showing that you've done a lot of reading about the place where you want to work or study. So make sure you look at their website, look up any recent news stories. They may have been in the news recently for something positive. That might be something that you want to bring up, and it shows that you're keeping up with the company or organization and their kind of current situation. So that's a good idea as well, something people often forget. Next. So being natural and chatty, this sort of ties in with small talk, which we were talking about at the beginning. People are obviously nervous before an interview. It's difficult not to be nervous. And this one is in many ways the trickiest one to master of them all. An interview is a very unnatural situation. It's difficult to be natural in that situation. It is an inherently awkward situation, but this does take a certain amount of acting to an extent. Try to be natural and try to be chatty if you can, okay, especially at the beginning of the interview. This is something that interviewers will see as a positive quality. It shows that you'll be able to avoid awkwardness with your colleagues. It shows that you'll be able to get on with people quickly and easily, and that you'll be good at bedding in as well. Next. So don't be afraid to talk about your weaknesses, okay? We talked about how to speak about your weaknesses in the best way. This is something that is going to come up in every interview. Interviewers will want to know about what you're good at, as well as things that you are not so good at. In many ways, this is a test of your honesty. How willing are you to talk about your genuine weaknesses? And as I said, it's absolutely crucial that you talk about how you deal with your weaknesses, and to talk about the progress you've made since you identified your weaknesses. Next. So be clear and detailed, okay? This is super important. And again, this is a balancing act as well. You want to be concise in an interview. Remember, interviewers might be speaking to up to 5 or 10 candidates in one day. They don't want you to ramble on for hours and hours. So you need to be concise, but at the same time, you need to include enough detail and clarity to say what you really mean, and to make it sound like you genuinely have an idea about what you're talking about. Short answers, while they don't take very long, might also give the impression that you don't have much experience. And one of the ways that you can do that best is by using real examples, okay? Using the STAR system will help you a lot with that, because it provides an underlying structure for exemplifying your achievements, okay? So being clear and detailed in an interview is very important. And if you are not clear and detailed, the interviewers will prompt you for more detail. That's their job. Often means that perhaps if an interviewer has to keep asking you for more information, or could you tell me a little bit more about this aspect or that aspect? If they keep doing that, it means that you're not being detailed enough on the first question. It means they have to ask follow-up questions, okay? So if that happens, perhaps on the next question, try to provide a little bit more detail and focus a little bit more, okay? Those are my top 5 interview tips. If I can add a kind of bonus tip, if I would add one more thing, it would probably be that obviously not everybody passes every interview. You don't always get the job, and you don't always get the place that you want. But one thing you can always do is to ask for feedback from the person who interviewed you, from the organization, from the institution. You might ask them, what could I do better? What do I need to do? Or what did I need to do to get this job or to get this place? And usually they are quite happy to provide this feedback. So every time that you do not succeed in getting a job or getting a place, always ask for feedback, because this can be really, really valuable for next time. So that would be a kind of bonus tip that I would mention at the end there, okay? So I think we may have a few questions now. I want to apologize, we had some connection issues there. I hope that you were mostly able to hear what I was saying. And if not, perhaps I can clarify now if anybody has any questions.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. So thank you so much for the very informative session. And like you said, we're going to look at some questions now. So here is the most liked question in our Q&A box. I will read it to you. Is it bad to introduce yourself as an introvert in an interview? Instead, should I pretend that I'm an extrovert? If not, how would you introduce yourself as an introvert without looking bad? You're muted, Andrew. Could you unmute yourself? Thanks.
That is a really good question. I think, first of all, I would, unless the interviewer specifically asks about it, I would try to get away from the idea of being either an introvert or an extrovert. Okay, it's not the kind of information that I would want to offer up, especially using those adjectives. So remember, we talked about the kinds of adjectives you use being quite important. I would stay away from saying I'm an introvert or an extrovert. These kind of, I'd say both words in some have some baggage. They have a little bit of negative meaning, both introvert and extrovert. If an interviewer does ask you, are you more of an introvert or an extrovert, then I would say be honest, okay? But focus on the positive aspects of that. If you're an introvert, You might say that this is also connected to your organizational skills, or the fact that you are very good at getting your head down and getting on with work and always meeting deadlines. If you're an extrovert, you might want to talk about how that helps you to interact with colleagues and work function as part of a team, and talk about interpersonal skills. But unless it's absolutely required of you, I would kind of stay away from those terms, because they are kind of what we would call loaded terms, which means that they have a lot of baggage attached to them. So that would be my advice on that.
Thanks for such practical advice. Here's another question. Some people have said in business context, humor is really significant element as much as ability. If it is right, could you tell me some advice, like how to use humor properly?
I would say try not to confuse humor for being open and social. I think those are more important than being funny. Obviously, when in an interview that nobody is looking to hire a comedian, you don't want to be, sort of cracking jokes. So if you manage to make the interviewer laugh once or twice, that's fine. But if you're not naturally the kind of person who is a funny person, don't try too hard. It will be really obvious and may make the situation more awkward. Okay. So humor can definitely help to lighten the mood. If you have a way of using that, if you're naturally a humorous person, then great, you can use that. But the main thing is to try and be as natural as possible in the interview. That's what they're looking for. I think the interviewers want to see how you would be in an office environment, how you would be with a team or with colleagues. They want to see what the real you is like, and hopefully a positive version of the real you. So they don't want you to be sort of buttoned up and stiff in an interview. That's the thing to avoid. If you can introduce some light humor, that's fine. If you're naturally good at that, go ahead. But I'd say it's impossible to teach somebody how to do that. It's something you kind of either have or you don't have. Something that you can learn to do is to be a little more natural, a little calmer, and imagine that you're not necessarily speaking to the CEO of Microsoft or Samsung. You're speaking to an interviewer who wants to see what you're really like as a person. Okay, so you want to project the most positive version of the real you, if I can say that without sounding too cheesy.
Okay, be real you. I think it's a good cheesy line. So I have a question from a contract engineer. It's he or she asked, how long is a appropriate time when the interview is 30 minutes long, 30 or 40 minutes long? Like how to introduce, like do a self-introduction if the interview is like 30 or 40 minutes long.
So they might ask you at the beginning of the interview, could you please introduce yourself? And that's obviously quite difficult sometimes to know, should I speak for 30 seconds? Should I speak for 4 minutes? I would say keep it brief for the most part. When you introduce yourself, you might want to talk a little bit about where you're from, talk a little bit about your work experience. They obviously want to know about that. And I think it largely depends on where you're applying. Ultimately, it is an interview. They're there to ask you questions about your experience. So you don't want to go on for too long in the introductory phase. So I would say you want to provide a concise rundown of your experience, okay, whether that's academic or professional. And I would say, I wouldn't probably speak here for more than about 1 to 2 minutes.
Okay, 1 to 2 minutes.
And if they want to know more, then they'll ask you some follow-up questions afterwards.
I see. Okay, thank you. So I have another question coming in. Could you give some tips on graduate school interviews and job interviews respectively? I think we have covered many points on both job interviews and academic interviews. So could you kind of sum up for the person, maybe he or she joined like during the interview?
Yeah, so I would say for graduate interviews, academic interviews, you're largely going to be focusing on your academic record. Work experience, if you have any, isn't going to come into it as much. It might, but the chances are if you're applying to an academic institution, most of the time you don't yet have any work experience. So you need to focus on your specialisms. You need to talk about why you're passionate about that particular area of study and why it's important to work in that area of study. There are also the things that are the kind of crossover between a professional job interview and an academic interview are strengths and weaknesses. Okay, so while the star kind of situation, task, action, result method is more useful for a job interview, I would say talking about your strengths and weaknesses is perfectly applicable to both. Okay, and you can make your weaknesses sound more positive in the same way for both as well. Okay, so I would say the main difference with a job interview is talking about real situational examples using the STAR method, and an academic interview talking more about your areas of specialism and why you think they are important to the field. That's what I would say, the kind of very broadly speaking, the main division.
I see, thank you. So another question, in terms of format, will it be better to follow a given format or be creative when answering the interview questions?
So you don't want to sound too formulaic. That's what I would say. If you get asked 10 questions in an interview and you use the same formula for answering every question, it's going to be quite obvious. Okay. Obviously, we've talked about some formulas, like the STAR method is a kind of formula, but that's for specifically speaking about your experience and examples. Okay, so I would say that is one formula which is very useful. Being creative, I'm not quite sure perhaps what you mean by being creative in an interview, but I would try and stay as close to real genuine examples and things that you have been through as possible. I would say it's very obvious to an interviewer when you are being too creative with your answers, which means kind of getting away from your real experience. Okay, interviewers interview a lot of people every day, so they normally find it pretty obvious if you are talking about something that you haven't actually done. So I would say stick to a formula like the STAR method for a job interview, but try not to be too formulaic in all your responses. Thinking about, is this question asking me to address my strengths and weaknesses? Is it asking me to talk about what I'm good at doing, what I'm able to do? Or is it asking me about a specific example from my experience? And then you might choose a certain formula to answer that particular question. Sorry if that's not a particularly satisfactory answer, but it's quite a broad question, I think.
Okay, thank you. I think it was a good answer. So I will cover another question here. What would be the ideal response when I'm not clear about the question asked, like not really getting the meaning or like not really knowing what is being asked to explain? Yeah,
so this does happen, of course, especially if English isn't your first language. First, ask them to repeat the question. It may be that you just need a bit more time. Don't be afraid to ask them to repeat the question. That's absolutely fine. Interviewers don't mind that at all. Then if you still don't understand it, I would focus on which terms you didn't understand. You can ask the interviewer to define their terms. You could say, could you please define what you mean by interpersonal skills? Maybe you don't understand this term. Ask them to define what they mean by that term. I would say one thing you want to avoid is just saying, what do you mean? Or saying, sorry, you don't want to say, I don't understand. I don't understand what you mean. So try to focus on the words or the part of the question that you don't understand. Never say, I just don't understand the whole question, because you will look totally out of your depth and really confused with the whole thing. So focus in on which parts of the question you need them to help you with and that you need them to define for you. Okay, it might just be a matter of understanding one or two words.
Thank you. Well, the time that we have prepared for the Q&A session is now like almost over. So do you have any question that you would specifically like to address, Andrew, if you're looking at the Q&A chat box?
I'll just take a look now.
Just the last one, so.
Sorry, I'm just looking in the wrong box here. 1 second.
Or I could pick another one if you would like.
So I found it now. I think the published questions. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I think we have only one that we could answer here. What are the useful expressions that are frequently used, especially in formal occasions? Like when you are answering the interview, like when you are answering and you want to buy time to kind of formulate an answer in your head.
I see. Right. So you mean questions that you can ask to buy time?
Like when you're formulating an answer, you don't want to give too much of a time, like muting. So when you have been asked.
People are often afraid of the silence, the kind of awkward silence. But actually, if you ask most interviewers, they normally, if an interviewee says, "Could you just give me a moment to think about that?" That's absolutely fine. Okay. They know that in an interview, they would rather you have, 20 seconds to formulate your answer than you waffle for 20 or 30 seconds before you finally get round to answering the question. So I would say, do not be afraid of saying, could I just have a moment to think about that? It might seem like a little bit awkward, and I know a lot of people don't want to do that, but I think it's better than and ah and just sort of waffling. That is much more awkward in my opinion. So don't be afraid to ask for a couple of, a few seconds to think about your answer. And when you're ready, you can answer. I think that is often something that people don't want to do, but is often the best course of action. And after you've actually had a chance to think about it, you can give a much better answer than if you just answer straight away. So don't be afraid to be honest and say that I need a little bit of time to formulate my answers. Most interviewers are fine with that, in my experience. If they're not fine with that, then I would be questioning a little bit about the place I'm choosing to work, because I think that would be very intolerant of someone not to give you 20 seconds to think about your answer,
True. I think it has points. Thank you so much for such informative session, Andrew. I'm sure attendees would have found it very useful. And please, everyone, send thank you messages and warm applause to Andrew for a lovely session. I will let you go at the moment. 참석자 여러분, 오늘 발표가 도움이 되었다면 채팅창에 감사 메시지 남겨주세요. 저희가 한 분을 선정해서 선물을 드릴 예정이니까 꼭 많이 남겨주시고, 이제 아마 대댓글로 이제 당첨 여부가 달릴 거예요. 꼭 확인해 주세요. 앞으로 영국 유학 관련된 최신 정보나 행사 소식을 받아보고 싶다면 저희 스터디 UK 카카오톡 채널 추가해 주세요. 그렇게 하면은 이제 앞으로 저희가 무슨 일 있을 때 알려드리니까 네, 많이 추가 부탁드립니다. 오늘 저희가 준비한 8번째 세션에 참석해 주신 모든 분들께 저희 진심으로 감사드리고, 저희 10분 후에 시작하는 9번째 세션에서는 이제 IELTS 시험과 그 시험 준비 경험담에 대해서 들어볼 예정입니다. 그 이후에도 스포츠랑 아트 앤 디자인 전공 토크까지 2개 세션이 더 준비되어 있으니까 많은 참석 부탁드립니다. 모두 코로나 조심하시고 즐거운 주말 되십시오. 감사합니다.